Hi, my name is Parish. I'm presenting this year at the Toronto Children's Ministry Conference on the topic of co creating spaces for appearing in churches and children's ministries. I'm presenting insights from a research project among church going families across the GTA. I used an online survey, interviews, and some direct observations to approach the question: how can we better create spaces for families of children with disabilities to truly appear, to belong, and participate in church gatherings and in church children's ministries? I think in our churches and children's ministries, there's a profound opportunity for families of children with disabilities not just to be present, but to genuinely appear. And by that I mean, physically, relationally, and even co-creationally. How do we together participate in the production, the creation of our community and our spaces? And I think this only happens when we learn and adopt ways of being together that allow each other, families, and children to begin to come out of the margins, to become visible, known, welcomed, and able to show the fullness of who they truly are. Um, and I think, in a very surprising way, that this isn't primarily about just accommodations in the way that we might traditionally think of it. Restructuring our buildings to be more disability friendly. Certainly, it involves some of that, but instead, primarily, it's about relationships and how to receive one another, recognizing each other, the gifts that we bring, and the ways that together we co-create the spaces that we gather in. So these are real stories, real insights from people in our region. Um, I'll start off just by mentioning about this term disability and what we mean by it. It's easy to jump to what we might call a medical model of disability, where we just see the individual themselves as having a limitation or an impairment that needs to be fixed or dealt with or helped, accommodated for. In this case, though, we are putting the placement of disability on the individual, on the person themselves, or on the family in which it exists. And we can already imagine the sorts of shame and even hiddenness that creates as people don't want to or feel they can't appear fully as who they are. Instead, a lot of scholars, theologians, activists in the disability community want to push back against that, arguing instead that disability is a far more complex relationship, or even a mismatching between a person's body and mind, their unique composition of who they are, and the social environment that they're required to participate in, to act in. So this is often called the social model of disability, and we recognize that a person might be disabled or limited just by the sorts of structures and expectations that are placed on them. And while not all disabilities can be sort of eliminated or erased just by restructuring our social arrangements, there is a lot to be said for reimagining not just our buildings, but also our attitudes, our beliefs, our rhythms, our customs, as things that often disadvantage or exclude or put into hiding some people whose bodies and minds just function differently than others. So think of disability as a far more complex social phenomenon in our communities. This shifts the conversation then certainly towards not just how do we build for and help those others come in, but how do we reimagine our whole way of being together with these individuals in all their uniqueness. This conversation matters a lot because a significant portion of our population, including younger people in our midst, experience life with what we might call functional difficulties. including some that are diagnosed and recognized as disabilities. Last year at the conference, I shared some stats from a 2016 national report. This year, I have some updated stats from a 2019 Canadian Health Survey on children and youth. And we see that across the board, about 14% of children aged 5 to 17 exhibit at least one form of functional difficulty in their lives. That just makes it more difficult for them to join and participate with gatherings, social activities, social spaces. And this probably means about 1 in 8 households have at least one child where this is part of their reality. And so I really wanted to consider, do these show up in our churches? And if so, how do they show up? How are they appearing in our churches and our ministries? Though families and children with disabilities almost certainly already attend our churches, even if partially or quietly, it's likely, especially in light of some of these surveys that came out for me and the interviews, it's likely that our church gatherings still do not reflect the fullest extent, the full proportion of people with disabilities in our communities. And even those who do attend our church gatherings, our Sunday mornings, our children's ministries, our midweek programs, their physical presence there does not still guarantee their full visibility, their full welcome and their full participation in ways that are most natural or fitting for them. So again, back to this primary research question of how can we better create spaces for families of children with disabilities to truly appear, to belong, and to participate in our church gatherings. So this question really prompted and drove this research project. The research included an online survey of which 34 respondents participated, in person or over Zoom interviews with 9 interviewees, as well as some direct observations at 4 different local churches. And of course, I recognize this is still a pretty small sample size. It's not representative necessarily of all GTA churches and what's going on in our midst. But I do think especially some of the very prominent themes that came up again and again, and how pointed and repeated they were, says something that we should pay attention to in our own contexts. So let's talk about the research and just the story that it tells us. I'll admit that when I began the research, I had a pretty clear sense of what I would find. I really thought I knew the sorts of answers and themes that were going to show up. I imagined really stories of inaccessible buildings, narrow aisles and ramps and loud classrooms and too bright of lighting and all these things. I thought that these were going to be kind of a primary thing that we needed to rethink and create better spaces for people with disabilities. And this is probably due to my own, and maybe you can relate to this, my own impulse to define and fix an issue, deal with, solve, help them participate and join in over here, right? And back to that very medical model of disability that I still have to remind myself of and push against in me. So that's what I thought I was going to find, a lot of just this physical conversation. And to be sure, it did show up in the research. There is room to pay attention to the accessibility and the structure of our buildings. At least one interviewee, we'll call it interview 10, was a church leader in the west end of the GTA, and they just recognized that the only access points to their building were up a stairway in the front, or else a very steep incline up a grassy hill in the back. So accessibility vehicles had to literally drive up onto this grassy hill just to drop off individuals with mobility limitations. Observations at another church in a rural region showed that the hangout space for junior youth after Sunday services was in this sort of attic space up a very steep stairway. And once inside, things like lighting and music and room decor just screamed sensory overload. It was really intense being in that space. Another congregation that I observed, I saw that the only access onto the sanctuary platform was up 3 steps on either side of the stage. And each year, this congregation hosts 2 or 3 children's presentations for the congregation. And as I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, what does this mean for a child who just can't access the same level as their peers? You know. And now I admit, some of these things that I saw or that the leaders recognize in their spaces are quite substantial. They're not quick fixes. They might involve a lot of budgeting and renovation and reimagining a space. And I encourage all of us to maybe think of those big picture items. However, some of the barriers that we have in our spaces, we can be mindful of and probably address right now as we are. I'm attaching a QR code for a physical barrier checklist from the Reformed Church of America. And this might just help you start to think through some of the barriers that exist, and maybe some things that you can approach more immediately in your own context. Now, I'll also say, when we think of barriers and accessibility, we do often think of things like ramps and doorways and accessible washrooms. But one of the things we might want to be mindful of is how often sensory barriers also have implications on who can really access and belong and participate in a space. The growing conversation around neurodiversity, such as autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, even mental health struggles like social anxiety, leads us to really think even more about things like lighting and sounds, and even just the social, the physical layout of given rooms. And if I can just sum up all that in one statement, I would just say, not everyone experiences the physical or social or sensory spaces of our churches the same. And for some, the way that things are laid out, the way that community is structured, the way that sensory input and participation is planned, is just too much to handle or too far out of reach. And that can be a conversation that might come up at the ministry conference itself, but perhaps you can think about in your own context. So I'll say all that's very important, the physical accessibility and barriers that we have in our buildings. However, in my interviews, in the surveys, as parents were given the opportunity to really express what was most crucial or at the core of their experience for themselves, surprisingly few talked about physical or sensory or intellectual, like curriculum type barriers. I expected that. I expected to hear a lot about that. And I was surprised that what I heard was something that I wonder if it's even more fundamental to our conversation about creating spaces in our church communities. Because in all, like 100% of my interviews and in most of the survey respondents that came back, the core topic that kept getting circled back to again and again was the topic of relationships. Something that isn't necessarily addressed with big renovations and budgets and teaching techniques, but something that seemed of the utmost importance to those who were experiencing disability and experiencing hiddenness and inaccessibility in church communities. So I went to work kind of looking through the relational topics that kept coming up. And I think there's 3 main relational themes that we can pay attention to today. The first is this. Over and over again, parents were talking about their desire for peer-to-peer connection for their children who had disabilities or functional difficulties. So that intentional time and space for their children to be with others and to build genuine friendships. So, for instance, in the survey, I asked the question, in what ways could churches reimagine or adapt their physical spaces? Notice I said physical, and I put in brackets, or their approach to children's ministry uh, to be more inclusive of your family or others. You can already see, again, I'm expecting there to be physical stuff that they're going to point to. 100%. Every single respondent, as one of their choices, listed better peer-to-peer support as their answer. By the way, the second most popular answer, with 60%, was better training for staff. So you see this in both the surveys and the interviews. Parents were saying things like, my oldest son just needs encouragement, not criticism. He needs people to remember his name and be purposeful in greeting him. He's been so wounded in church, and it's a downward spiral. He presents as sullen, which makes others hesitant to approach him, and this makes the problem even worse. Another said, many mornings are very structured and full, and it's hard to find enough free space in Sunday school where friendships can actually form. Another respondent said, my daughter spends so much time in a special class at school. At church, when she appears different from others, it's easy for other children to get confused and not know what to do. Like, why isn't she singing like us? Or why does she sit out during our games? Now, in these cases, and in most conversations, it wasn't about intentional exclusion, kids that were making fun of or intentionally putting these children off. But instead, it seemed to be more about the absence of intentional inclusion, intentional belonging. So one parent said, our child doesn't get made fun of, but they also just don't get invited in. Other kids don't have a chance to really get to know them. Or in early years, it wasn't as difficult, but as my daughter gets older and other kids pick up on her disability, I wonder if they just assume if she isn't smart enough or even able to be a friend. A lot of these reminded me of last year's conference where I brought out Eric Carter's Circle of Belonging. And this identifies 10 dimensions of belonging that came out in his research among families and people with disabilities. He pointed to themes like the need to be invited, to be actively sought out and welcomed by those around us, the need to be welcomed, the need to be known, to be befriended, to be missed when we're not around, and the need to be needed. These are all dimensions of belonging that if they're present in our lives, we tend to feel more like we belong in the group. So these were things that came up over and over as parents were talking about, gosh, I wish there was just more intentional peer-to-peer relationships for my child to belong within. Besides the desire for peer-to-peer connection, parents also pointed to this desire for meaningful conversations with leaders. So a number of parents told me that pastors and children's ministry leaders have rarely, if ever, asked about their child's needs or gifts. One parent said, our previous church was traumatizing. I left in tears. I asked if my son could be included in activities, and I was informed that the Bible says that to have friends, you must be friendly. Another said, I've talked with our children's pastor many times about my daughter's difficulty with all these big and adventurous activities, and I finally stopped bringing it up because nothing ever slowed down or changed. Another said, and this was very heartbreaking, a board member at a church once told me very plainly that there's no place for someone like our son there. It hurt and made us very angry, and we haven't gone back to any church since. Now, when I asked on the survey question, have you ever spoken with a pastor or leader about your child's needs or experiences? And if so, can you comment on these conversations? Only 20% said that they had. And of those, almost all said that there had not been any significant change after those conversations. What families wanted was not just a better program or a better theological comment on disability and community. They wanted a conversation. They wanted a listening ear, a place where they could appear as they were, to share their story and their experiences. You know, for a church leader to go from just running a program for or ministering to their family to being with their family. The third relational theme that came up, and maybe the most painful and persistent, was this theme of hiddenness. The sense that no one really knows what's going on. No one really knows the struggle or the disability that we are experiencing. Parents described holding back from participating fully in church communities and even in children's ministry programs because they feared being misjudged or misunderstood if they were to truly appear as they were. And this was complicated, and I learned a lot in this one. A lot of people taught me about the cultural expectations, the cultural components of what was considered normal or acceptable in their specific context. This might be more complicated for some than for others. In one congregation in the East End of Toronto, two separate interviewees opened up and told me culture plays a big component in our experience. Our culture can leave us quiet, hidden, and unaware of supports because we're often left to feel shame of not being normal. We're so scared of being centered out as disruptive that our kid is not a good kid. Another said our temptation is now just to control the narrative about our family, to decide who knows what about us. Partly that's to protect ourselves, but also it's a way of protecting our son. He's already different than others in his community. We wonder, will autism be another difference that he has to live with? These are complex and painful, and yet these same parents understandably gushed about the giftedness, the uniqueness of their child. It made me wonder, what gifts are we missing? What things are we overlooking or left hiding behind our cultural norms and our social expectations? One of the leading voices in community and belonging is Peter Block, and he reminds us that community is both created and sustained, not just through structured plans and efficiency and programs, but this radical openness to each other, this curiosity about those who are among us. So he presents some essential questions to consider when we're thinking of our communities and gatherings, questions that include considerations of gifts. Like, what is it that no one knows about you? What gifts do you bring here? And what would happen if you could truly appear as you are today? What would happen if your gifts were brought and put on the table and received by this community? And do you see that how incorporating these types of conversations into our church gatherings, whether in our programs, in our leadership meetings, in our parent interactions, change the posture from what can we do for this person to what would happen, what's possible if we were really to receive this person and this family and all their uniqueness among us. And so we have these three big themes: this peer-to-peer connection, this conversation and openness with leaders, and this sense of, I wish I could be less hidden. I wish I could really come out and appear as I am. And these three things together, I think, give a good segue into this conversation of creating space. That might sound surprising to you, but let's talk about space for a moment and what it really is. Space, if we were to really strip it back and think about it in its most essential form, is not just a flat, kind of lifeless container that we enter into and live and gather. But space itself is far more of a social product. It's something that we produce. And it's something that we produce by living and interacting and imagining within. It's something that we co-produce with others around us. Now, this might sound a little complicated when you first hear it, but really think about this. Why do our churches look and function the way they do? Why do your classrooms look and function the way they do? In fact, why do any of our spaces in our lives look and function the way they do? And before you jump too quickly at an answer, really think about that. The answer likely includes something like, well, it just seems to work for us, or over time, enough people gathered in this way, in this rhythm, with these movements and actions that we just required hallways and roofs and washrooms and chairs and so on. Of course, all that is true. And it's kind of the point that I'm trying to make. Again, space is not just a given, it's not just there, but rather it is produced by us as we live and move and think and relate together as a community. Spaces grow out of ideas and actions and interactions among people. Right? So as we think of space in our church communities, we're not just thinking of uh, containers, and we're not just thinking of flat, lifeless spots that we gather in. We're thinking of places that reflect the relationships, the rhythms, the beliefs, the activities that over time have formed it as it is. So if we want to go to work restructuring and reimagining and recreating spaces for our ministries, we don't necessarily have to start by thinking of renovation projects and blueprints and budgets. But instead, we might start to think about how we can renew the very relationships that produce space in the first place. I think this is really important for us to notice, especially in light of, again, this research, the stories that have been told by these families, and again, a lot of really in depth thinking about the productions of space in our society. So maybe instead of starting with plans to, widen doorways and buy new furniture and reimagine lighting and sound, a children's ministry team might begin first by just booking in-home meetings with families and children and just learning how these individuals best participate in relational contexts, you know. So for example, a children's ministry might be planning to redesign their kids area, but first they might choose to host a few of these meetings or even a few shared meals among families in their church space. As they listen to each other's stories and they start to notice the patterns and the ways that people gather, they realize that some of the children's sensory needs and physical needs make large group gatherings really complicated or overwhelming. So they imagine more quiet spaces, or they imagine a certain type of rhythm together that seems to fit and include all this uniqueness. So, very organically and relationally, a new imagination of a new space begins to emerge from relationship. And most importantly, parents and their children already feel like they've been able to appear and belong in that space. Or consider leaders in a junior youth group who spend time teaching their group about the importance of peer to peer connection as youth. After a while, one of the students might notice that one of the children with limited mobility can't join them upstairs after service to hang out. Maybe without even being told, they slowly start to remain downstairs. Only one at first, but then soon more and more might gather. They start remaining downstairs, bringing their conversations and snacks and laughter together with them. And over time, maybe that lower space becomes the new gathering place, not shaped by a plan or a restructuring, but shaped by a friendship. And I think you could probably take some time to think about other ways that focusing on relationship, on peer-to-peer connections, on conversations, on vulnerability and honesty, might begin to reshape and reform your spaces as a church. Because in these cases, inclusion is not something that we necessarily design or build for. It's a living process of co-creating, of learning to come together in deeper relationships. And in turn, spaces themselves are changed, renewed, reimagined, and reproduced together. Right? When we commit to relationships of mutuality, the types of spaces that we produce together will slowly change. And not just in layout, but in the spirit of community, and become places where every child and family can truly appear, participate, and belong. Thank you so much for your time listening, and I hope we get some time to interact and think together about this really important theme. Bless you.